Hey there, it's Cooper Codes, and in this video we are going to be creating this basic React application that connects to a Notion database. So the idea of the application is that we can go in here, put in our name, I'm going to say Cooper Codes, put in your phone number, whatever it is, and we're not doing any validation on this side, these are all being saved as strings. Then anything else you might want to tell a certain person, like I need this certain item. So this is a great example of when I press submit to Notion here, I can go over to my database, refresh, and I'll be able to see all the different information inputted by my React application. So the process which we're going to go through when building this is we're going to create an Express server to handle the API calls to Notion, and then we're going to build a React frontend to use that Express server to do this operation here. This is a great introduction into getting to use Notion for the first time, and is a very basic implementation of the Notion API. This API becomes especially interesting if you have an app, like let's say a note-taking app, where you want to integrate Notion to your note-taking app, for example. You can do a similar operation where you take a user's notes, for example, and then you shove them over to their Notion page. Alright, so let's take a look at what we need from Notion in order to use the API in the first place. Alright, so getting started, you're going to want to head over to what Notion calls integrations. So integrations are pretty much ways where you can have your functionality on top of a regular Notion page. When you create a page in Notion, you have the ability to have integrations interact with that page, for example. So let's get started by creating our integration we're going to use for our application. So press new integration here and give it whatever name you want. I'm going to call it user responses, because we don't really have any real functionality, just a very simple save. I'm going to make sure it gives it all the different capabilities, and I'm going to make sure it can read user information, including email addresses. So this is pretty much giving you everything off the bat as the default. So now that we've submitted this, we now have our internal integration token. This token is super important. You want to make sure you save this for later. As far as Notion goes though, we're totally fine now. We can scroll to the bottom and press save changes, and now our user responses integration is going to be accessible on the current account we're logged in on. So just go to your regular Notion page under this current account. So if you have a completely blank Notion like I do right now, you're going to come up and see an untitled page. So we're going to call this database. And to create the actual database we're going to be interacting with, we're going to want to say /database. And we're going to say an inline database here, for example. I'm using a table database, but you guys will see there are a lot of different ways you can use databases in Notion. Table isn't the only one. And now that we've created this database, I actually want to open this specifically as its own page. So you can press this thing right here, open as page, to do that. All right, so now we are at this database specifically. So I'm going to say database for users. And I'm going to set up a couple of things here. So we need a name here. We can get rid of tags for now. So I'm going to delete the tags column. We need a name, and we also need that phone number that I showed earlier. And we also need that anything else. So I'm going to call that extra information in our database. So now if we were to add information to our database, for example, the name, phone number, and extra information, we have those columns to look at, similar to how our React application is looking for that data here. An important thing is make sure you're on your database page, and you're going to want to save this part of the link. So there's this $V. You don't want that part. You want this middle string of numbers between the Notion cell and then the $V. This is the actual ID of your database that we are going to use to interact with the API. So the two things you need for the API is this ID and then that integration token I discussed earlier. Then we're good to go. So on the Notion side of things, we're all set up. Let's hop over to our text editor to get started on creating the Express server to call the Notion API. All right, so the first thing we're going to want to do is create a server.js in an empty file. So like I said before, we're going to get into the React part later. Now we're going to create an Express server to talk to the Notion API. So our Express server needs a couple of packages to get started. So I'm going to say npm install express at notion hq/client. That's the Notion client we're going to be using to interact with the API. Then cores, which helps with cores errors, and then body-parser, which is going to help us get variables from a put request, which I'll explain more in detail later. So npm install those and you should be good to go. Now it's going to have a package.json and a node modules next to the server, which is exactly what you want. I'm also going to npm install nodemon, so we don't have to continually restart the server over and over again. It's going to make development initially pretty easy here. So go to your package.json, and then I do this all the time, but then say scripts, go in here. So this is going to make sure that whenever we run npm start, it's going to run nodemon server.js. And we can try this out by just saying console.log hello, going in here, saying npm start, and you can see that it's just going to run hello, but we can eventually have it do more advanced things later, right? So first things first, we're going to get all the different things we need from those packages we just installed. So the first one's going to be express, where we're going to say require express. Now I'm going to grab the client from the Notion client, which is at Notion HQ/client. Now I'm going to grab cores from cores. So cores helps you fix any cores errors you might run into when calling the Express server. So we're going to grab the body parser. We're going to say var body parser equals require body parser, and we specifically want the parser to get JSON bodies. So what you have to do for that is you have to say var JSON parser is equal to body parser.json. You don't need to fully understand this part. It will make more sense in a second when we actually use it, for example. So to initialize our app, we're going to say const app equals express. This just means we're starting our Express server, and then we have to do a couple things like app.use cores. This means that we want our app to use whatever the cores function provides us here, which, like I said before, helps you with the cores errors. I'm going to set some constants relevant to our server here. The first one's going to be port. I'm going to run this on port 4000, and I'm also going to have the host be equal to localhost. All right, so now we're going to get into the Notion stuff. So we are going to initialize our client by saying const client is equal to new capital C client, then pass in the options and say auth is equal to, this is where you want to have your secret token from before. So your internal integration token, you're going to want to copy this, go back to your server, and then paste this into the auth. This is pretty much saying, hey, make a client using this secret. So it's specific to whatever integration you have. Then you're also going to need that database ID like I discussed before. You're going to grab it by going to this part of the link like I discussed before. So now we can have our app listen to a certain port and a certain host. So I'm going to say port, comma, host, and then we're going to have this function here. And when this gets hit, that means our app is listening successfully. So we can say starting proxy at, I'm going to say host colon and then port. So for example, just to be like, what does this mean? This is pretty much saying localhost, for example, colon in the middle, 4000. That's what this is going to give us if we successfully have a proxy server at localhost 4000. All right, so with Express, we can do app.post, we can do app.get to make get and post requests and things like that. We are going to make a post request to this API from our React application. And what it's going to do is it's going to be a post request, and we are going to post the name, phone number, and then the extra info. And the desired functionality of this would be to make a database entry in a Notion page with the database ID above. So it's specifically tied to this database. All right, so let's get started. We can say app.post. I'm going to say /submit form to Notion. It's kind of a longer way of saying it, but when you say app.post like this, it's going to be something like this. Localhost 4000 /submit form to Notion. That's how we're going to call this. Is whenever you hit this route, it's going to have whatever code we have inside of this post. We are going to use the JSON parser here. This is just a syntax for Express when you use a certain parser on the body. So we're going to have the JSON parser here, and we're going to make an asynchronous resolver here. And you might be thinking, why is it asynchronous? It's because we're going to have to use an await statement when calling the API, because we want our code to wait for that API response to get fulfilled. So we're going to make some assumptions about the data that's in our request. So our request.body is going to look something like this. It's going to have a name property, it's going to have a phone number property, and it's going to have an extra info property. These properties are all coming from our front end. And so I just want you guys to know that before I write this next line of code, which is where we're going to be getting these name, phone number, and extra info. So this could be like, Cooper codes, for example. That's what it's going to kind of look like, just to give you guys a basic idea. And let's just say these are all Cooper codes, just to show you that they're all strings. So we are going to make some constants at the top of the data we're getting out of this request.body. So I'm going to say request.body.name to save the name. I'm going to then make the phone number one to save the data from the phone number. So I'm going to say request.body.phone number. And just to be clear on something, this request.body is coming from our request. And so in the front end of our React application, we are going to be sending in these variables specifically in a JSON object. And then the final one is going to be const extra info is equal to request.body.extra info. All right, and so now I'm going to make a try and catch statement here. Try and catch is nice to use when you make an API call, which we are about to do, because it allows you to pretty much get an error if that ever errors out, and then you can kind of figure out a reason as to why it would error in the first place. So you can make a try, and then if it ever breaks inside of the try statement, instead of just destroying your whole server, it at least shows you the error it caught. All right, so inside of here, we are going to say const response is equal to await. So at line 14, I'm actually going to change this client to the word Notion. That's what they have it in the documentation, so we might as well do that as well. notion.pages.create. And create is going to take in an object. And so this object is going to have all different types of arguments for when you want to create a Notion page, for example. We want to make sure that the thing we're creating has a parent. And so this is how you can actually use the database here, is you can say its parent is a database ID, and it's going to be equal to database ID constant that we made above. And so this create also needs an argument of properties. This is pretty much saying, okay, in our Notion thing we are creating, what type of properties are necessary to fill up the database, for example. To be honest, Notion kind of has strange syntax on this, so for your specific use case, things might be different. For example, our name is going to look something like this. Name, it's going to have a title, which Notion requires to be an array. Again, strange syntax, and then it requires it to be an object inside of here, and then this object has a text property, and the text itself has a content, for example. So if you have a text block, it's going to say what do you want the content of the text block to be. For this first one, we're going to have it be the name constant we created up here. Again, this is kind of a strange syntax. Notion seems to have this object-oriented syntax where everything is an object, so you can have a lot of different properties, and this kind of makes it easier to have a lot of things. But if you just have one thing, for example, it kind of looks like a lot to look at. And so we can take this name here because it's going to be very similar. So take this entire name, so copy from here to here, make a comma, indent in, and then copy this again. So instead of name, we're going to say phone number next. Phone number isn't going to be a title. It's instead going to be a rich underscore text, which is what Notion expects for this. And then under here, we are then going to have another thing, which is going to be our extra information. And again, extra information is going to be rich text. This is because when you create the name, you're actually creating an entire page, which you'll see on the Notion part. When you have the phone number and the extra information, you're pretty much just looking at basic text in Notion. And then we want this content of the phone number to be that phone number const we created above, and then this content of the extra information to be the extra info const we created above. So if we get past this response, we can successfully log the response that the Notion API gave us. And we can also say console.log success. If we got here, that means we successfully called the API without getting an error, because remember, in the try and catch statement, if this errors out, if this await errors out, for example, it's going to catch and then log whatever that error is here. All right, so now we have the full API call for the pages.create. It's looking at a certain database and it's giving all of our information from the request. So we actually have the full Express server ready to go. So if you go into your terminal and npm start, you'll see that we actually have the proxy server starting on localhost 4000 and we are good to go. So right now we could technically call the post on /submit form to Notion, but we'd have to use something like Postman or something like that to get all these different variables inside of there. And I think it would make more sense just to get right into the React front end. So let's do that. So something I like to do when I have both of these servers running at the same time is to create a split terminal. So I'm going to make the split terminal on the right a little larger for now because we're not going to use this server for a while. We can npm start it though, just to have it running in the background if you want. So on the left, npm start your server. It's just going to run in the background. Nothing's really going to happen there. And then on your right, we're going to want to say this: npx create-react app client. So now we're finally getting started and actually creating the React application. Once that's done loading, you can go and cd into your client, and then now you're actually going to be inside this client folder here, which is in your React application. And you guys might be surprised, but we don't actually have to install anything extra on top of React because it's so dependent on our backend, on our server.js, that we don't have to install any other libraries. All the real functionality of the Notion API is happening on our Express server. So let's go into the source of our client, and you're going to want to go to app.js. So app.js, and we can npm start in the client here to see what the website looks like. So app.js is going to have us with that basic React boilerplate. We don't really want that anymore, so I'm going to delete the entire header here. We're going to have a couple of string inputs like I discussed before. And so one thing we can do to save string inputs in React is to use the useState hook. So I'm going to import useState from React. And so now we have access to the useState hook, and we're going to have three different states. It's going to be the name, the phone number, and the extra info. So I'm going to say const name set name is equal to useState, and because the state's a string, we're going to set it equal to an empty string initially. And so we can copy this over 2 more times to create those other states. It's going to yell at us for a second, but don't worry. We can then say the phone number for this one, and then set phone number. Then we can say extra info, and then set extra info. but make sure the E and the P here are capitalized, my bad. All right, so now we have some strings that we can eventually send to our backend, but they're not really being changed by any inputs. So let's create a very basic little container here to keep all this stuff organized. So, I'm not a UI guy, but I try my best here for you guys to show you the front end. So I'm going to say the div max width is going to be 500 pixels here. This is just to make a container so it's not super sprawled out on your web page. And I'm going to center it to the middle is what the margin 0 auto is doing. And so I'm going to have that header at the top where it's saying, interested in learning more? Put your info in below. Something like that, just to this is like kind of a basic website, and I would not recommend using Notion as your production database, which is kind of a funny thing I saw online, but do whatever you guys want. Good luck. So we can start by putting a little paragraph here that says the name, and then we're going to put a name text input. So I'm going to say input type is equal to text, ID is equal to name. This isn't super necessary, but I think React might yell at you if you don't have IDs, but do what you want here. Then whenever this text input is going to change, there's a little bit of a shorthand syntax where you can take the event of that text input changing and say, hey, call the setName function and get the event.target.value. And because we are getting the event from the input, it's pretty much saying this input.value. Then I'm going to say phone number. We can pretty much copy this input from above and do the exact same thing. It's going to have a type text. I can make the ID phone number if I wanted instead. And then instead of set name, we want to be set phone number. So let's take a look at what our React application looks like so far. All right, looking pretty good. We have a name and we have a phone number. So that's super great. So I'm then going to have that little anything else. And you guys saw that wasn't a straight up regular text input. It was actually a text area. But super similar syntax. I'm just going to say text area on change. It's the exact same on change code. So you can say get the event, do a little arrow here, and then say set extra info, and then e.target.value. And with the text area, you're going to need to have these other things. Rows is equal to 10. I think it's like how many character rows, but don't quote me on that. And then calls is equal to 25. So it's like the size of the characters. It's going to kind of make a box. It looks like this. 10 by 25. And so let's go over to our React application, and boom, we have that text box, which is looking pretty good. You can also resize it if you want, but as you'll see, it's not the best thing in the world, but hey, it gets the job done. Then at the bottom, I'm going to wrap this in a div, and I'm going to have a little button where when we click it, it's going to run a submit form to Notion function. And you guys will see this is probably going to break. Yep. So we're going to go up here and then we're going to define this submit form to Notion. So I'm going to say function submit form to Notion. For now, I'm just going to say console.log. We are in. There we go. So if I look at the console here and I submit to Notion, it's going to say we are in, which is super great. I could even say like plus name if I wanted to see the name here. And this is kind of a weird way of doing it, but if I go like a bunch of different things here, then I submit to Notion, you guys will see. And let me make it something real. I'm gonna get Cooper codes. Submit to Notion, and you guys will see that we're actually getting that name in the string because our state is being changed whenever that text input gets changed for the name. So working as intended, which is super great news. So now I'm going to use something called the fetch API, but it's not like an API like the Notion API where it's hosted online. They just call it API because your code can interact with it pretty much. And fetch allows us to make a call to a certain endpoint, for example. But in our case, our endpoint is going to be localhost 4000. So we're going to want to call that localhost that we made earlier. So http://localhost 4000/submit form to Notion. And guys, triple check that this is spelled correctly. I always see people running into issues like that where it's like submit lowercase f here or something, and it's like, why am I getting errors? And it's the spelling. So make sure you triple check that. And once you have this link right, we're going to want to give some options to our fetch API saying, what do we want to do with this link specifically? Well, one of the first things we want to do is we want to have the method be post. This means that we are posting to this certain submit form to Notion, which is good because if you go over to our server.js, it's app.post. So we want that post request to happen. Then we also want to pass in some headers. To be honest with you guys, this is just in the documentation of fetch that I saw when you're passing in JSON. And so it said to do something along these lines just to, be safe. And so I'm going to be safe because it was working for me without the headers, but you never know, when someone else is following this tutorial and they're on a different browser or something, who knows, right? So pass in these headers. Then we're going to have the body of the request, which I talked about earlier. And so what we can do is we can do json.stringify, and stringify pretty much says convert your JSON to a string. surprise. And we can then parse this JSON string in our backend, which is what the JSON parser is doing. And so we can make an object here. And remember, this object on the inside is not a string at all yet. So this is just be a regular JSON object inside of here, where we say, okay, set a name property equal to the name value we have in our state above, set the phone number property equal to that phone number property above, and then set the extra info property equal to the extra info property above. And you'll see these are all lighting up now because we are using their values, which is super great. And so you can then do a .then statement here and get like the response and like change the response to a JSON, but I don't really plan on running into any errors here. So this is probably not going to get used, but you can always do something along these lines where you take the data from that response above, pass it down here, and you can say console.log, success. And then you can kind of put that data next to it like this. And then if this doesn't get hit and you instead is an error, you can do a catch statement to this then. So if this then gets, destroyed pretty much, if there's no data, for example, it's going to get caught here and it's going to catch an error instead. You can then console.log that error. You can even do a console.error, but I'm just going to do console.log. And you can say your error is then going to be the error object that we got from right here. So we have the full fetch made. It's going to the backend code here. So when we call this fetch post, what's happening is it's going to say, okay, go to our server.js and then start running all this code. So it's going to do exactly what this code says, which is it's going to try and get a response. And then when it tries to get this response, it's going to go to pages create and then attempt to create this page with a certain database ID like we discussed before. So hopefully when we press this button in our front end now, it's going to call this code correctly. We are going to have the correct database, correct client here, and it's going to make that new database entry in our Notion. Okay, one last thing is you want to go to whatever database page you have, which you hopefully know your database page for sure because you've copied that link already from above, and you want to go to share. And trust me, you're not sharing this with your friends unless you want to show them how cool you are and how you can use a Notion API, but I don't know, I'm probably not going to show my friends this, but you want to go and share and you want to see select an integration. Your integration should show up right at the top. If it doesn't, there's a way to find it. I think you can search for it, but it should say select an integration and it should be your integration that you're making. So press user responses here and then press invite. That means the user responses, the integration we made, is now able to use our Notion database. And so this is a super important part of this. So now that we have that figured out, we can go back to our React application and actually input some data. So I'm going to say Cooper codes here. And if you're curious why I'm on Edge and not Chrome for this part, is because Chrome was autofilling my personal phone number. So, you're going to have to do a little bit more than watch my videos to get that, but who knows? And let's see, anything else? Let's see. You should subscribe to Cooper codes if you got this far. I kind of agree with this guy, whoever's making this ticket, I'll be honest, but do what you want, live your life. And so let's submit this to Notion and see if it actually updates in our Notion database. All right, so guys, we have the full process of the functionality here, which is super cool to see. We have Cooper codes over here, which is a Notion page we can open up like this. That's the title. And we also have the extra information here, the phone number, and then the extra information over here as well. So hopefully this video has been a great introduction to using the Notion API. The great thing about APIs is once you have one call down, you can kind of go through documentation and create whatever functionality you need for your application. So if you're not, using pages.create, maybe you're saying pages.something else, whatever else is in the documentation. And so you can definitely change up your functionality for whatever your app is based off how you use the API, which is a super cool part of using external APIs like Notion. All right, guys, well, hopefully this has been a super informative video when it comes to using this API and also when it comes to making an Express server when you're making calls to the API. All right, thanks so much for watching.